the other thing that's interesting, and this is part of the reason that I'm so concerned with the pathology of the universities, is because it seems to me, and this sounds conspiratorial, but I'm afraid I'm still going to discuss it. The really serious postmodern neo-Marxist disciplines, like women's studies, for example, they're very, very good at producing activists who are very, very good at occupying mid-level bureaucratic positions and dominating relevant institutions. So, for example, one of the things that's happened in the province I live in Ontario, this month, is that the Ontario Law Society has now made it mandatory for lawyers to come out with a statement on diversity and equity. So they have to do that as part of their practice. And they basically have to admit to white privilege and systemic racism within the profession, despite the fact that their own damn data indicate, for example, that Asians are overrepresented in the legal profession. Which, the whole idea is, if you have a theory and then you have a data point that invalidates the theory, that's a reliable data point, then your theory is wrong. And the fact that the white-dominated legal profession actually promotes Asians at a rate that exceeds what you'd expect by a population analysis absolutely invalidates the idea of systemic racism. But it doesn't matter, because the Law Society has been taken over by a small coterie of extraordinarily dedicated postmodern activists, and the amount they care for facts is zero, since they don't even believe in the existence of facts. So
We've had the same thing happen to the Law Society in Australia. My husband's a lawyer, and he brought home the Law Society magazine, and on the front cover was an article about unconscious bias training and how it's going to be mandatory for all lawyers in Australia. I sent off a couple of emails to psychologists I know who do research in this area, and one got back to me saying there is no data, there are no meta-analyses, and there are no randomized controlled trials that show that unconscious bias training has any effect after a couple of hours. Like, it might have an initial effect on people when they're doing a pencil and paper survey, but after a couple of hours, that's all gone. And there's no long-term effect on any measurable outcomes in the workplace. So there's no...
That's right. It's a complete scam. It's an scam. And it's based on that, the implicit association test, of course, which is being pushed by people who have a very explicit, radical left-wing agenda, by the way, because Mazarin Banaji is known quite well for that. And it's been absolutely misused. Like, the relationship between so-called implicit bias and categorization isn't well understood. We don't understand the relationship between implicit bias and the kind of in-group preference that makes you love your own family, for example, as opposed to, equally distributing your care across the entire expanse of 7 billion people, the 7 billion people that make up the human race, which of course you just simply can't do. The behavioral effects of that implicit categorization, let's call it, rather than bias, aren't well understood, and there's no evidence whatsoever that unconscious bias retraining programs do anything that's positive whatsoever. And yet it's being pushed, especially, and being made mandatory at all sorts of levels of corporations. And I can't understand why the lawyers, for example, put up with this. It's like they're being accused. They're being accused of guilt before innocence, which is that they're all a bunch of racists. They're being accused in the most appalling way, because they're saying that, well, it's even unconscious. They're going after their target's unconscious perceptions, which is so totalitarian that it isn't even something that the bloody Soviets could have thought up.